How to draw flowers for beginners, that's what we're talking about in today's video, and I've got 12 really easy tricks for you. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find not only drawing videos like this one, but an awful lot of watercolour, a little bit of mixed media, even some motivational stuff too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell icon, you can get notified every time I make a new video for you. I make at least one free video here a week on YouTube on a Thursday with extra content for Patreon subscribers. So I've been doing a few drawing tutorials here on YouTube recently. I've been teaching drawing actually, as well as painting. I've been teaching drawing for nearly 20 years now. And lots of you have asked about a tutorial for drawing flowers. So here we are. I'm going to give you 12 really easy tips that are going to help you with your flower drawings. Now in this video, I'm making the assumption that your drawing is actually an underdrawing that you will go on to paint. So we're not going to be talking too much about things like shading. Of course, let me know if you want that sort of drawing tutorial as well, and I will make that for you. I've actually been thinking about doing some charcoal drawing here on this channel, so let me know if that interests you too. But for today, I'm going to be looking at drawing as an underdrawing that you then go on to place possibly watercolours or another medium on top of. However, if you're just drawing, if you're not interested in putting colour on, this tutorial will be equally as useful for you. It's just that there'll be one or two of the tips that I'm going to tell you about that will be especially useful if you are about to go on and do a watercolour painting on top. So let's get on and go through these 12 tips. Where necessary, I'll be showing examples of my own work, showing you some photographs of flowers, and also pointing the camera downwards from time to time so I can demonstrate the techniques for you. So my first tip for you is that composition is important. It is just as important for botanical and floral subjects as it is for anything else like landscapes or buildings, but so many people don't consider it at all when they start their drawing or start their painting. So it may be that you're doing a botanical subject and it just sits in the centre of your paper. That doesn't mean you're off the hook. You still have to consider how somebody's eye is going to move around the drawing or painting. You have to consider what's going to lead the eye into that subject and what you might need to do for things like balance. It may be, for example, your botanical subject is slightly unbalanced on one side. You might want to consider adding something like a leaf or a shadow on the other side to balance it out. Now, you might have watched videos by me on landscape or building composition and think, well, what's that got to do with flowers? But actually, it's all the same thing. You're still considering how the viewer's eye is taken into the painting, how it's led around the painting, and what your focal point is. You still need to avoid the problems that I've spoken about in other videos that affect composition. And it's particularly important if you're doing a painting with multiple flower heads. Now, I've seen so many paintings of, imagine a painting just of a rose bush where you have a lot of roses on the piece of paper, and all you have is this piece of paper, and the roses just sort of sit all over the paper. There's nowhere for your eye to be drawn to. There's no particular focal point, and it looks almost like wallpaper. It becomes a pattern rather than something that your eye is led in towards. So please do consider composition, do consider balance, consider all of the things that you would normally think about if you were drawing a landscape. Now, although there are many possible problems that you can have with flower drawing and composition, there's one that I see time and time again, and this is making the vase more important than the flowers. The flowers should always be the main event in your drawing or your painting. Now, of course, if your subject only has leaves, that's a different thing, or if your subject is something like a cacti where everything's green, again, that's a different thing. But if your subject is flowers, don't let the vase, don't let the leaves, don't let the background overwhelm the subject. Nobody looks at a flower painting to look at the leaves. That's not to say that the leaves and the vase can't be a very beautiful part of the painting, but please don't let them overwhelm your painting, and it all starts with the drawing. Let me show you a mistake that I see my students in class make time and time again. So on my piece of paper here, I've drawn two squares, and you're going to imagine that each of these squares is a little picture in itself. So in other words, this is your drawing board, this is your sketching pad, and I'm going to show you the mistake that my students make, and this usually happens when they're drawing or painting a vase of flowers, although it can be relevant to other types of drawing too. But what happens is this: they don't actually sort of tie down how much room the vase is going to take. So the vase always ends up, becoming much bigger than expected. So we get our vase in like this, and then we start drawing our flowers in, obviously I'm just cartoon sketching here. And what you end up with is this, really tiny selection of very sad looking flowers in a huge vase, and it's usually as well far too jammed up the top of the paper. So what you actually want to do is consider how much room your vase is going to take up. I would suggest no more than a third. You can occasionally get away with more than a third depending on the shape of the vase and depending on the other elements in the picture. Consider if you have the vase in real life, if you might take a higher viewpoint so you're almost looking down on it more. What this will do is that it will sort of deepen the perspective and you'll end up looking at a much more foreshortened vase, and you'll have a lot more room, you know. And let's give this a few leaves here. You know, you'll have much more room then for your leaves, and you'll have much more room for your flowers, because the flowers are always the main event. So you don't want to end up with this huge vase, and especially if it's a really plain looking vase, you want to make the most of your flowers. Make your flowers large and consider at least downplaying the size of the vase. As I said, it's not an exact rule. If you've got a painting where the vase is very large, that can work as well. But you have to consider it overall and how it's going to look in your picture. And so much more attractive to see a large amount of flowers and leaves with perhaps a nice vase offsetting. You know, it might have a pattern on it, might be a lovely vase, but nevertheless, you don't want to end up with this. And the reason this happens is lack of planning at the beginning. Tie down right from the start how big your vase is going to be on your finished picture. You know, even make a mark. The vase is not coming up higher than this. It's not going down lower than this. And then you have this space that you have to fit your vase in. Don't just start drawing your vase and, you know, let it become some kind of vase Godzilla that just takes over your painting world and it becomes out of control. And then you've just got a few little flowers, sad and pathetic and lonely at the top. So my second tip is that before you even start drawing flowers, you should be studying the construction. You should understand basically what you're looking at. Now, I don't want you to be sort of, you know, working at home and your husband or wife walks in and you say to them, well, Michelle told me to paint the petals. I'm up to 123 now. Obviously, this doesn't, you know, this doesn't count for things like chrysanthemums, things that I've got multiple petals, things like roses where you might have 30 or 40 petals. But if you're painting something like orchids, it's really important that you understand the construction and don't get this wrong. You will be amazed how many people out there are really into flowers, into birds, and they will pick you up. I can't tell you how often I've met somebody who said to me, oh, that drawing of the bird you did, there were actually 3 tertiary wing feathers and there should have been 4. So it's really important, you know, even if you work quite loosely, it's really important that things are accurate, because otherwise you won't get that overall feeling of the flower. Now, the best advice I ever heard was to spend twice as much time looking as you spend painting or drawing. That's not bad advice, is it? But for me, I don't like strict rules like that. And I find that the further along you get with your painting or drawing, the less you need to look. But in the beginning, you really need to look a lot. Certainly when it comes to botanical subjects, it's so important to understand what you're looking at. So I'm going to point the camera downwards. We're going to look at some photographs and I'm going to show you what I mean. So let's look at some photographs of flowers, and I want you to get into this idea of studying construction. So for instance, this flower here, well, certainly you're not going to count every petal, that would be madness. But look at the edge of it, there's a roundness to it, isn't there? There's a roundness to it that makes it quite uniform, so we don't have a very ragged edge on this flower. And look at these petal shapes, aren't they interesting? They're almost kind of funnel shaped, and yet there's a point towards the end of them. As they come into the flower, they close up. So this flower has a center point. We can say that the petals are funnel shaped and that those funnels are larger, and also they tip further out as they go out. Do you see them tipping further out? We can say they get bigger as they go out, and that the ones in the center are entirely closed up. Look at the tips of them as well. There's almost in some of them a tiny little point or a tiny little sort of dip in, or almost like a W shape on the points of these petals as well. These are the things that you need to be noticing before you start drawing. It's really important that you're intentional with your drawing. You don't just sort of launch in and get a rough idea. And if you like loose painting or loose drawing, I'm not letting you off the hook either, because even in the loosest of paintings, you have to honour the shape of the flower and you have to honour the characteristics of the flower. You don't necessarily have to be super detailed, but if you get the colour wrong, if you get the petal shape wrong, it's going to be noticeable, and it's actually more important with loose painting than it is with tight painting, because you have less information to inform the viewer of what they're looking at. So let's look at this one here. Again, a rose, you're not going to count every petal, but look at the petals themselves. Look how they change. Look how these ones closer in tend to tip over and go to a point. The ones around the outside are much more rounded. Again, some of them have a point or a little M shape or a W shape in. You can also look at the construction of the buds. So look at this one here. It looks a bit like a pansy, but I think it's some form of orchid. Again, you want to be counting the amount of petals. So we've got one large one in the middle here. We've got two that come up. We've got a little centre bit here. And then we've got two of these long petals either side. And what you'll find is that throughout the plant, all of the flowers have that amount of petals in that arrangement. Unless you have some kind of mutant flower, you know, unless it's the case of the four-leaved clover. And I found one once. So they do exist, you know, unless it's something like that or it's been eaten by a caterpillar or something along those lines. Every one of the flowers of this species will be constructed the same, and it's important to understand, especially if you have one that's behind another one, because it'll help you to put that in accurately. Look at this one here. We've got this centre part, and the centre part itself, it's not just things that come out from the middle, it's almost in an orb shape. We can look at the petals and say they're very cup shaped and that they tip up. Does every flower have the same amount of petals? Well, you'll have to count and find out. But it's important to know these things before you start. And here's a classic example. Here's an iris. Every single iris on the plant that is the same species will have the same amount of petals. What it'll help you with is, for instance, I've got something over here. You know, is that part of this flower here, or is it part of a flower that's sitting behind? We'd need to see more of them really, or we could look them up on the internet and you could have a study and see how these flowers are constructed. It'll help to stop you from making mistakes. And again with this one here, it would be easy, wouldn't it, to assume that some of these petals behind are actually belonging to this flower in front. So it may be important when we paint or draw this flower that we understand which ones belong to other flowers so that we can push them back in the painting and bring a bit of drama and a spotlight to the one in the front. Look at the way the top petal tips over but the others don't. We've got this shape here, but if we look at this one here, we can see that from the side it actually comes out quite a long way. It's very three-dimensional. That may mean that we actually put more shadow behind. Look at this one here. Honestly, it reminds me of that Alien film. It looks like an alien, doesn't it? Perhaps it's only me. Do you see an alien? I see an alien there. Alien plant. But whether it's from another planet or not, it's really important that you understand the construction before you start drawing. My next tip is always to draw your flowers first. Now I'm going to drop a painting in that I did of tulips in a glass vase on a patterned cloth. You can imagine how long it took me to do this. This wasn't a photograph, this was actually set up in my studio. Now I drew and painted the flowers first. By the time I got to the stage of painting the cloth, there were actually no tulips. It was quite an amusing sight actually. There was just this vase with a load of stems sticking out of it because flowers don't last. Flowers also move, so if you are working from real life and you start drawing other things first, you may find that by the time you've finished, the flower that you thought was looking so beautiful and facing towards you has actually completely turned its head and is now facing out to look at the window. So when you have a nice setup, you always want to draw your flowers first. Even if you're working from photographs, you still want to draw the flowers first. And this is because you will naturally give the flowers more room this way. And as we discussed earlier, you want the flowers to be the main event. You want to give them enough room. And you want to make them the star of the show. If you end up sort of leaving a space and drawing them in afterwards, you often find that you just do them too small or they just end up cramped. So this is another tip for you, whether working from life, where your flowers move and wilt and change, or working from photographs where you need to give those flowers enough room. Always draw the flowers first. Now this doesn't mean, of course, that you don't make a few marks on the paper, perhaps for the the area a vase is going to go in. Of course that's important, but when it comes to the actual detailed drawing, flowers first. And completely related to my last tip, my next tip is to draw your flowers big enough. So often I've seen people draw their flowers so small and so cramped that there's literally no room to put the paint. I'm going to point the camera downwards now and show you what I mean. So we learnt here about the importance of leaving enough room for your flowers. What about drawing those actual flowers themselves? Because so often I've walked around a classroom teaching a painting class and people are doing their underdrawing and I look at it and I think, where on earth are you going to put the paint? Because imagine it's daisies, for example, and I've blunted this pencil so that you can see, because people often just have a blunt pencil, they haven't bothered to sharpen it. And they're doing daisies and they're doing something like this. And you know, whether you're painting or not, even if you're just shading, where on earth is the room on this to put any details, any shadows? Often there's a few mistakes been made, so the whole thing ends up a little bit smudgy, and you look at this and there is just nowhere to put any paint. So I'm going to sharpen this pencil now and give you a second example. As if by magic and the power of editing, let's look at a better way of drawing this flower. Now remember that if your flower is a drawing that's going to become a painting, it's not necessary to shade. You want to put the absolute minimum of pencil on the paper, because all of your shading will be done with the paint. And even if it is just a drawing and you're going to be doing some shading, give yourself room for that shading. Make sure that you have some clean paper you can work into. I defy anybody to get a good watercolour painting on the top of a drawing like this. So let's talk now about actually drawing the structure of your flowers and the difficulty of making flowers face in strange directions. So what beginners often do is they end up facing their flowers forwards. It's a mistake that people make actually with portraits as well. Somebody with their head on the side will end up with their head turned to face us. It's the reason that the Egyptians painted everything with flat perspective, because you have an idea in your brain of the way a flower looks. Imagine a daisy, something like that. You know that it has a round centre and it has even flowers that are spaced around the outside. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to override this idea of what your brain thinks a flower looks like and what the flower actually looks like when it's facing in a different direction. And this can be tricky. It's a matter of stopping yourself from making assumptions and making yourself look very carefully at the drawing. But there's a two-step trick that I have for you. We're going to look at the first part of this now, which is to find the outside shape of the flower. So if you happen to have taken my online course for watercolour pencils, my flower painting course, you'll recognise this photograph. It's one of the ones that we use, and I've picked it up because we've got multiple flower heads. Although it could be said to be one flower head, we've got multiple small sort of florets within this. We've got these flower heads. Look at this one here, it's facing straight on. Although it's not a circular flower, it's more of a square shape, isn't it? So let's have a look at that. So let me make an idea of the outside shape of it. So it's like this. If it was a daisy, it might be a circular thing. But what about a flower like this? Now you can use straight lines for doing this. You can use curved lines. You can use a combination of the two. So what I'm going to do now is have a look at what shape this one is from the outside. This one's facing on the side, so it's going to be quite different. And it's almost more triangular or maybe diamond shaped, isn't it? And finally, let's look at this one here. Kind of similar, but it's more curved. More like this shape. So that's the first part of this technique, is to find the outside shape. So let's look at the second thing that we need to get the flower perspective correct, and this is to find the center point. So you found the outside shape, now you've found the center point. I'm going to show you that once you've found those two things, your flower will automatically face in the right direction, and things like foreshortening and perspective will just become easy. So we've got our outside shapes. Let's now find our centre point. Now in the one that's facing forward, the centre point is pretty much in the middle. So what that enables us to do then is to take our petals out. Now it's fine to go outside of this shape a little bit. It's just a guideline. It doesn't have to be exact. But what it will do is it'll just give you a place to put your flower. And there we've got a flower that's facing more or less forwards. So what about the next one we did, which was this one down here? So again, let's find the center point. It looks like it's in the middle, but when we look at it, actually, it isn't. Now, if we go from here to here, in other words, widthways, it's in the middle. But if we go here to here, it's closer to this side. So we can say it's in the middle, but it's closer to this edge. And again, from there, we can start drawing our petals. And you see they've become distorted, they've become much longer than they are deep. And I think there's another one hiding up here. We know that because we've counted and there's 4. And so that idea of finding the construction of the flower. And there we are, we've got a different one. So what about this third one over here? Again, let's look at finding this center point. It's further to the left than the right and it's way up the top. So let's take it right up here. So from there, We've got some real foreshortening going on this top petal, haven't we? And then we've got this one coming out here. And then we've got one coming out the side here. And another smaller coming out here. So I hope you can see that this idea of finding the center point will enable you to fit your flower head in and to make it face in any direction. Let's look at the idea of a daisy, and I'm just doing this one from memory, but let's look at the idea of a daisy that's completely facing upwards. So what we would have is we'd have a shape that was something like this. And the center point would be right down here. So from there, we just take our petals outwards. And let's say that one's tipped down as well. So again, this works for any kind of flower. Once you have the outside shape and you have the center point, from there it becomes really easy just to use that shape to get a flower that is facing in any direction. It works for any shape of flower. All you need is the outside shape and the center point. At this point, if you're enjoying this video, if you're getting some value from this free video, can I ask you please just to do me a favor and click that thumbs up, click that like button. YouTube rewards channels with audience interaction. I'm heading towards 40,000 subscribers at the point of making this video. I'm so grateful to all of you who watch me on YouTube. If you can click like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment, it helps my channel to grow. Have you ever struggled to draw a leaf or a petal where it's turned over and you can see the back in a certain place? You know, perhaps the tip is turned over and you can see the back of the petal or the back of the leaf. How on earth do you draw this? I'm going to show you a very simple technique. I call it the figure 8 technique. So let's look now at the idea of a lily petal that's tipping over. So they're quite wide, so they're quite long, aren't they? And we'll take it up like this. And I want the other side to tip over. So let's go round like this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a figure of 8 like so. Now I'm going to draw in the underneath and rub out that excess line. Let's look at a rose petal perhaps. Again, we'll take a figure of 8 and then we'll join that underneath. And again, now we have the underneath of the petal or the leaf showing. So this doesn't work for every single leaf that's tipped over, particularly if it's at an extreme angle facing towards you. But nevertheless, if you just want to turn the edge of a leaf or a petal over, it's a really, really simple way of making sure that the underneath lines up with the top. Next, we're going to go back to that idea of a center point in your flower, and we're going to talk about how important this is and how everything must come from that center point. Even if the center point is obscured, either by the shape of the flower, the actual species of the flower, or just because it's hidden in the painting, nevertheless, everything must come from that center point, and your stem must also go towards that center point too. I've often seen, you know, a vase full of flowers and there's sort of a flower there and there's just no stem that reaches it at all. So it's really important to consider that everything must work. Flower heads don't just float. They must at some point have a stem that's going to them. Of course, that may be obscured. You may not be able to see it, but if you can see it or part of it, you need to put it in. So let's look now at the importance of the center point and making everything realistic by honouring that centre point and making sure that it's always the most important part of your flower's construction and the way it sits on the paper. So let's look at this idea of stems being aligned with the centre. Now that doesn't mean that a stem necessarily has to travel up and go straight towards the dead centre of the flower, because some flowers have almost a lump on the back. So what you get on the back of some flowers is you get something like this going on. So we've got the petals coming up here. Then what you've got here is you've got a bit that sort of sticks out like this and then comes down in the stem. In that case, if we're looking at this one, for instance, if we've got a bit on the back that sticks out, you might find that the stem actually comes up to the side like this, because we know it's then going in to the center. If you could see it, it would be going in like this. So it's not necessarily the case of aligning something directly with the center, although with certain types of flowers that can be the case, but it's a matter of considering the stems and making sure that if you have a flower and it's got a bit of space below it, that there's actually something holding it up. So there might be a leaf in the way, perhaps just up here, stopping you from seeing the stem where it hits the flower. But if you've got a gap of white space down here and there's no stem, you won't be able to see what's holding that flower up. And it's not something that people will notice in a conscious way. They won't sort of think to themselves, ah, that third flower on the left doesn't have a stem holding it up. But they're just going to look at your picture and think that it doesn't work properly. And what's wrong is that it's not working from a physics point of view. Your flower heads are levitating like an asteroid. Although technically, I guess, asteroids don't levitate, but you know what I mean. So just make sure that when you have flowers, if you can see the area where the stem would be, make sure that you put your stems in. And always consider that every part of your flower must come from the centre. Even with a flower like this iris, the centre is hidden. It's in here somewhere. But nevertheless, everything comes out from that centre point. Don't just start them randomly over to the side somewhere and hope that it looks like it hangs together. Always, always consider your centre point and make sure that everything is heading towards it. So we've talked about the importance of the centre part of a flower. Let's look now at the idea of a centre line down petals and leaves and how it can help us to draw them effectively. Now, of course, some petals actually have a centre that you can see, like lily petals often have stripes down the centre. Other petals don't noticeably have a centre line, but the line exists as a point of construction, whether or not there's actually a physical line there, and it's so important in helping you to face your flower petals and your leaves in the right direction. That's what I'm going to show you right now. So I've drawn this flower here by using centre guidelines. I rubbed them out after I needed them. Perhaps you can see them here. And I started from the centre. I faced them outwards like this. I looked at where each one might be going, and this is something that you can do with any petal. You can start from the centre and just ask yourself, what direction does it go in? If there were an invisible centre line, how would it look? And you can see that this is really going to enable you to get a petal that's alive, that has movement and direction. It's such a useful technique. Now, if you're doing something like a daisy with loads of tiny petals, it might not be necessary. For any other type of flower, it's really helpful. It's especially helpful for flowers that have complex centres like this, because although it's not a petal, look, we have a line here, don't we? It very distinctly curves round. So if I were placing it here, it would go like this. And from there, it enables me to get all of those little shapes in with the idea that it's all facing in the correct direction. Again, I can take another petal outwards. What about this one here going down here? You can see how getting that centre line down the middle of petals works really well. It's fantastic for leaves as well. So you never want to try and draw a leaf like this because you've got no guideline for it. It could go anywhere. You always want to start with your centre vein, and from there you'll be able to get your leaf looking like it's alive rather than just having a flat shape like this one, which frankly just looks like it's been done with a cookie cutter. Now by getting this centre line, you can make your leaves and your petals look alive. Let's talk now about the way you're actually drawing, the way you're actually using the pencil to make the line. It's so important that flowers flow freely. I have recorded that about 5 times because it's a bit of a tongue twister. I'm not going to try and say it again. But it's more important than accuracy. In other words, to have a flower that looks like it just is smooth-edged and beautifully explosive from the centre is much more important than getting your flower 100% accurate to the flower that you're looking at. Let me show you what I mean, and if you're bored at home, try and say flowers flowing freely. So I am not good at botany. I often don't know what plants are called. I don't know much about the science of them, but I do understand a little bit about how things grow. And there's a difference between how things like trees and grass grow, where they come up from the ground and they inch further and further and further out, as compared to a flower where the petals unfurl ready-made from a bud. So often when people, for instance, draw tree branches, they draw them very curved like this, and it doesn't look realistic. Now, when tree branches grow, they do in fact grow along a little way, and they're trying to get towards the light, and then the season or the time of day changes. That's where you get tree branches almost seem like a collection of little straight lines. But when we're doing petals, we don't want to do this. They come out from the bud, unless something eats them like a caterpillar. They come out of the bud 100% smooth and perfect. They don't grow a little way and then change direction. They come out ready-made. So therefore, if you have some beautiful large petals like these ones, and you try and draw them in little dots like this, you're just going to end up with something that's very, very rigid and flat looking. It's really important that you allow your hand to move on the paper. And you'll see here that I'm not moving my fingers like this. I'm moving my whole hand. In fact, I'm pretty much moving from the shoulder and the elbow. And we're going to just sweep. Now, of course, when you draw like this, you may get a little bit less accuracy than this, but it's far, far better. And you will end up with a flower that's looking much more realistic than if you sort of inch along and try and get it, you know, to the millimeter in the exact correct shape. It's far better to let your flowers just sweep along. The next thing I'm going to talk about is something that I've told you about in previous videos, and often people sort of go into the comments and they say, aha, I'd never even thought of that. And that's the idea that you don't have to do all the drawing at the beginning. Floral and botanical subjects can be really complex, and you can end up doing so much drawing that you make mistakes. You end up painting something you think is a petal, bright pink, and you find out afterwards that it's a leaf and it should have been green. Now let me be 100% clear, I am not advocating for leaving all of the drawing until the later stages of the painting. It is important to do an initial drawing, and it is important actually to plan out your drawing and where everything's going. However, if you have multiple stems or multiple flowers, plants behind plants behind plants, it really can become too much to do it at the beginning. So what I advocate you to do is plot out where everything's going and start with the things that are in the front, and then you can draw other flowers, other plants behind. Let me show you a couple of examples where I've done this. I'm going to put up a painting that was just an absolute mass of tangled undergrowth. Now, I did not do all the drawing at the beginning. I would never have known where to put the green and where to put the colour. I would have just got in a complete mess with it and screwed up the whole thing. So in a subject like this, you want to consider doing your drawing in stages. Let me show you a completely different painting I did that is more botanical. Now, I actually only had one stem of gladioli. They were in my last garden and I didn't plant them, they just used to come up. And I literally only had one stem. So not only did I need to move it around to make it look like I had a whole host of stems in my painting, but also it stopped that problem again whereby I might accidentally put green on pink or pink on green and mess up. I literally drew one stem, painted it, and then drew another stem and painted that. As I said, I'm not advocating for starting painting without doing your drawing or doing your planning. That's really super, super important. But what I am saying is that there is no rule. There are no drawing police that will come to your house and fine you because you didn't do all of the drawing at the beginning and then do all of the painting at the end. If it's easier for you, do the drawing in stages. It can actually be a big help when you come to doing something like watercolour painting as well, because you're not getting that pencil trapped under as many layers of paint. I give you permission not to do all of the drawing at the beginning. This next tip is not only connected to the last, it's really, really important for getting accuracy, and that's to draw through things. So if you want to place one thing behind another, it's always important to draw through the thing in front. It's a little hard to explain, so I'm just going to point the camera downwards and show you exactly what I mean. So let's take this petal here and let's look at the idea of drawing something behind it. Now imagine there's another petal or a leaf going behind it. What a lot of people will do is they'll try and draw one part of it here, and then they'll try and draw the other part of it up here, and what happens is they don't end up being aligned. It just ends up looking wrong, and it is wrong because if you continued these angles around, they wouldn't meet up in any way. So let's get rid of that, and let's look at a much better way of placing that petal behind the other one. All we're going to do is start here and draw across. And then we're just going to rub out the part that we don't need, that can't be seen because it's behind the first one. And then we can go along and strengthen. And we know that this works because we drew it in one go. The exact same thing happens with stems. So don't start bringing a stem up here if there's a stem going behind this and then try and bring it out the other side and hope it lines up. You want to take it all the way through like this. And then again, we just rub out the bits that we don't need. And strengthen. And now we find that everything is properly aligned. It's no different from the idea of drawing a horizon that goes behind a tree on one side and comes out the other side. You want to continue that line rather than take it into one side of the tree and then find that as it comes out the other side of the tree, it's too high or too low. Drawing through things, make sure that they're placed effectively on the paper and that you get a realistic look where one part of an item that goes behind another part of an item is completely properly aligned. Do let me know in the comments which of these tips you found the most helpful, and if you have a look in the video description, that's just by clicking the little downwards arrow, you'll find some free PDFs that you can download for no money whatsoever. And if you're interested in further training with me, I do have online courses, and you can also get extra videos on Patreon. You'll find links to everything in the description of this video. And I have another free video for you all about painting composition. I think you're going to find it really, really relevant and really, really helpful. You can watch that video right now.